Hey guys, so I was recently challenged to design a set of baby gates for this modern looking staircase, and you can see that there are glass partitions on either side of the stairs and there's a wall on one side. Part of this challenge was not to drill into the wall or into the staircase itself, so let's take a look at what I came up with, because there's really not a whole lot of mounting points here to mount something like this baby gate. And so you can see I've overlaid the CAD model on this image here, and so we can zoom in on that and we can get rid of those gates because they're just basically box frames with horizontal slats, so there's nothing really fancy going on there. Once we get rid of the gates, you can see the actual frame, and surprisingly the frame's not all that complicated either. There's a long 2x4 that runs along the bottom, tying in all of the vertical posts, and there are 3 vertical posts. The 2 on the left hand side are just 2x4s that are upright, and on the far right hand side it's just a 2x6 that's upright because the glass partitions are offset a little bit. Getting rid of those, we can take a look at the actual 3D printed parts. So I'm actually clamping to the glass partitions on either side of the staircase with these custom 3D printed glass clamps. Now they just screw together with some M6 screws, and there's some rubber on the inside that grips onto the glass. And on the far end there's an oddly shaped mount here that clamps onto the railing mount to secure that far post into place. And so I'm going to begin by pre-assembling my glass clamps, and so each glass clamp has 2 brass heat set inserts meant for M6 screws, and these inserts press into place using a generic soldering iron, and the plastic will melt around the knurled surface and give those M6 screws some extra tear out strength. In the recessed rectangular area, I'm going to be taking some rubber strips and I'm going to be super gluing those into place, and the rubber strips will provide some extra friction so the glass clamps will firmly grasp onto the glass partitions. With the general plan in place, it was time to get to work, so I cut my vertical post 36 inches high, and this is the same height as a standard baby gate that I measured from, and my vertical posts are just made from select pine that I found at my local Home Depot. I used my router to round off the corners so there's no sharp corners for the child to hit their head or face on, and then I started marking out the center of the post to where I can mount my 3D printed clamps for the glass. So I'm marking my centers here, and I'm just going to be screwing those clamps directly into that wood. There's going to be one at the very top of the post that's going to sit flush with the top post, because there shouldn't be anything sticking up on top of the post for anything like clothing or string or rope or anything of that nature to get stuck on so a child could accidentally strangle themselves. And so each glass clamp simply mounts with 2 number 8 screws into the narrow face of the 2x4. With the top clamps mounted, I'm able to get the vertical posts in place and start marking out the location for the bottom clamps so that they do not interfere with the first step of the staircase. Then I was able to mount my lower glass clamps to the posts, make sure the posts are plumb, and then tighten them down and clamp them to those glass partitions. And now that I'm happy with their position, I'm going to make a light mark on the cross member here that runs across the entire gate at the center of my posts, just so I don't lose their position later on. And that's because we're going to be removing these posts in order to mortise them for the gate hinges, as well as drill the pocket holes to mount them to that cross member that runs across the entire gate. Additionally, on the center post and the far left post that attaches to the railing, I'm going to have to router out a pocket for the striker plate that the gate latches engage with. And so I designed my own safety latches, and we are going to be 3D printing those and assembling those later on. We'll take a closer look at those later, but right now we'll just take a quick look at the striker plates that we are going to be installing into these posts. Installing the striker plates is pretty similar to mortising out the posts for the hinges. And so the first thing I would do is mark their location and trace out the striker plate. Then the next thing to do would be to remove the majority of the material with the router. And then you can come in and remove the corners with a chisel. And finally install the actual striker plates with the 2 countersunk screws. These are just going to be number 8 screws that are designed to fit into the striker plates and mount them to the posts. Then I can bring my vertical posts back to the horizontal cross member and clamp them into the correct position. I'm going to be using the pocket holes with the appropriate pocket screws to screw them into the horizontal cross member. First, I'm going to check that they are perfectly perpendicular, and I'm going to have to pull the whole thing away from the staircase because I've positioned the pocket holes to be in the least visible sides of those vertical posts. And then I can get the whole assembly pushed back into place and install my 3D printed railing clamp. And this railing clamp eliminates the need for me to anchor this vertical post into the wall so I don't have to screw into my drywall. And now with the frame more or less complete, I can move on to making the gate door frames. And so I'm going to be using the combination table here that I built called the Sinister Saw. If you guys want to check out how I built this thing, you can follow the link in the top right hand corner of the screen. But I'm going to be cutting out these 2x2 pieces of wood that make up the gate door frames. And I'm going to be using the table router portion of my Sinister Saw combination table to router out the ends of these 2x2s so that I can use half lap joints to joint them together to build a square frame. Getting the two square frames laid out on my workbench was pretty straightforward. I just used some corner clamps to ensure the corners were at a perfect 90 degrees, and then I used my wood glue and brad nailer to secure those half lap joints together. Then I could come back to my vertical post, level out my hinges, test fit the gate frames and make sure that those are level, and swing them in and out a few times just to make sure that there's no interference before proceeding any further with building the gates. And once I knew that the frames no longer needed any major adjustments, I was able to remove them from the hinges and now come back and clean up those half lap joints with a file. So I found that it was helpful to cut the joints a little bit on the long side so that I could clean up the faces like you're seeing here so that those corners end up flush with each other and very sharp. And with the excitement of the project nearing completion, it was time to bust out some dance moves before cutting those 1x2 pieces of pine that will make up the horizontal slats on the front face of the gates. Then with the frame back on the workbench, I've taken my first slat, lined it up with the top edge of the gate, secured it into place with a little bit of wood glue and some brad nails, and then I have these 3D printed spacers that I'm using to space out the next slat, a consistent 3/4 of an inch away from the previous horizontal slat. So these are going to give me consistent spacing all the way down the frame until I get to the bottom edge, of which the last horizontal slat should line up with that bottom edge perfectly if my measurements were done correctly. And so as it turns out, I am able to do some measuring and simple math because the last slat lined up perfectly with the bottom edge of my gate, and then I could come in with the wood filler and start to hide the brad nails. At this point, I also noticed that the round portion of the hinge was interfering a little bit with those horizontal slats, so I used my router to route out some little notches in those slats so that the hinges can fit flush with the frame. Finally, I'm ready to hit the gates with the palm sander to finish off any of the rough edges and round them out, as well as prepare the surface for the final stain. And after a little bit of fine tuning, if you get everything just right, your gate should sound something like this. All kidding aside, it was time to stain the gates, and I'm definitely not a wood expert, but I think the staircase was made of ash and it has a yellowy golden sort of appearance to it, so I need this pine to look similar. Now it's not a perfect match, but I found that a classic oak on this pine does a reasonable job matching the staircase, and 2 light coats do the trick, and the stain is actually a stain in polyurethane in one application from Minwax. So I'm going to apply 2 light coats and that will do the trick. So now we can take a little break from the woodworking portion of this build and we can assemble the 3D printed safety latch that I designed. So the main body there is in my hand, and I'm going to take these 2 springs and I'm going to be installing these first into the main body. So the first spring slips into the recess through the top hole and it sits in that pocket, and the second spring sits in the pocket perpendicular to that on the inside. Now we can take our button, this is the top button, and it slides in through the top through that square looking keyhole, and there's a circular boss that engages with that first spring and keeps it into place. Next we can take our bolt with that funky looking geometry on the front, and that's going to control how the latch behaves when we push and pull those buttons, and so it's going to slide into place. Again, there's another circular boss that engages with that perpendicular spring, But before we can get it into place, we got to take our top button and push it down. This part's a little tricky, so I'm going to grab a screwdriver and I'm going to push the little rectangular tab on the front. I'm going to use that to push it all the way down until I can get that bolt engaged, and you can see it snap into place there, and that allows the whole assembly to snap into the retracted position. So at that point now I can take my four number 4 by 1/4 inch long screws and I can put the back plate on. And so I designed the operation of the safety latch to require some finger strength and dexterity that I thought a small child or infant wouldn't have. So in order to open the gate, you got to press the top button and pull in on that bolt. And in order to release it, you can just simply press the top button and the springs will release it. And of course, the release is not as important as actually opening the gate, which, like I said, you got to kind of push and pull at the same time. And hopefully that prevents any child from operating and opening the gates. And then mounting the latches was pretty straightforward. I just positioned them in place with a clamp, and I had the bolt engaged in the striker plate. And so when it's fully engaged, the gate is obviously closed and cannot be opened. But when the bolt is retracted, it leaves enough clearance in order to open the gate. And so once I found that sweet spot, I just used the countersunk holes and put some wood screws in. And finally, for some additional safety here, I designed and printed these 2 braces that fit between the stair stringers, and they screw into the back of the horizontal cross member. They provide a bit of additional lateral support to the whole assembly. And so that concludes the build of these modern baby gates, and I hope you guys enjoyed going through this process with me. Now, if you guys are looking to build your own gates, it's unlikely that you'll have the exact same dimensions as me, so I'm not going to provide dimensional plans to this project. But what I will do is provide a link in the video description to my Thingiverse page, where you can find the 3D printable files that I've used for this project for things like the latches. Now, you guys can incorporate those into your own project, and if you need something with custom dimensions, I would love to be able to help you guys out. I have been pretty busy with a baby lately, but if you leave a comment in the comment section down below, letting me know which dimensions you need changed, I may be able to provide you those files in a reasonable amount of time. And so I hope this video inspires you guys to build something of your own in case an off-the-shelf solution doesn't work for you. Now, if you guys really appreciate the work that I've put into this, as well as making those files available to you guys, there's another link in the video description down below where you can buy me a coffee. And that's basically just making a small donation to my YouTube channel to allow me to continue on with projects like this and investing time and resources into building them and sharing them with you guys. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys for sticking with me and watching this video. Hope to see you guys in the next video.